The balance between secrecy and transparency is an enormous problem in the intelligence community today because you need to rely on more than just the intelligence community for some of the major challenges that this country's facing. And if you keep secrets, you don't get to tap into the incredible intellectual and innovative mass that is the American body politic. One of the most industrial, resilient, resourceful, innovative people, in history. If you're keeping secrets from them, you don't get to tap into it. And it's even worse if you're no longer the most innovative element. If the intelligence community isn't producing the best information or the best analysis, and private companies are, then you're sitting on secrets that are actually hamstringing you. So that's, the argument against secrecy.
Well, welcome back to Navigating Noise podcast. I'm really excited today to have Jeff Rogg with us. Jeff is a senior research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I believe I got that correct. Welcome. Jeff, just to kick us off here, I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit more about your background. I know that you've had a lot of time in academia, but it's always been kind of interfacing with the government. And do you still work for the government, or is that an easy thing to answer?
Sure. Had an interesting background, and probably like a lot of us in academia, when we're in college, we don't see ourselves being professors or on the other side of the classroom ever. So I didn't expect that. But you're right. I sort of have always weaved in and out of interest in national security and military history. I was a Latin and ancient history major in college. I wasn't very good at Latin, but I always liked the history, and particularly military history. So ancient Greek and Roman military history. Kind of interesting segue, but due to a rugby injury in college, I had wanted to be in the military, but I would have been delayed. So I went to law school. And during my first year of law school, I worked for the U.S. Army JAG Corps. And I thought that it was a little too much law and not enough Army. So after law school, I enlisted in the military, actually, as a guardsman and just as an infantryman, and got to sort of see a different side of national security, particularly, enlisted infantry. Very different than even officer, and certainly different than what you read about in books. And so I always stayed close to the national security space. Couple injuries in military courses later, I went to Georgetown, got a master's in security studies, and that was the decision point where it was, do I try and work for the government or pursue more academia? And I had a professor who said, if you have questions you haven't finished answering yet, go get the PhD. And so I did. I got a PhD in military and diplomatic history from The Ohio State University, but I didn't just want to do military or diplo history. I always was interested in, just like a lot of us, spy stories and the unknown history. So I became an intelligence historian, and it's been a journey. I guess I'd say really interesting one, but it's always brought me back to the intersection of academia and national security studies.
Well, that's super fascinating in a lot of ways. And I guess one thing that I was kind of excited to talk to you about is like from the vantage point of like Filter Labs, we are like founded by someone who has mostly been an academic, me in my life, have a company, and we talk a lot with intelligence officials. And for someone outside that community, sometimes these conversations are just strange. And sometimes I leave with colleagues who, spent a lot of time, who have subsequently joined Filter Labs, spent a lot of time as intelligence officers. Like, why are they always so weird? And they kind of try to help me understand sometimes the relationship that, they're wanting to relate to you this way or that way or this way. And I guess I kind of like what I've never really gotten a straight answer on, and what I'm hoping you will answer in a straight way, because you are free of weapons, as they say, and is that, like, what is the ideal relationship that the intelligence community wants to have with someone in academia, someone in a company that's maybe trying to sell something to them, but what is in their mind the ideal relationship?
Sure, there's a long history, of academia, particularly in the United States. I'm looking at it more from a US angle, but academia and the IC being interrelated. Nathan Hale was a Yalie. A lot of the first crop of CIA officers had elite or Ivy League educational backgrounds. There was a reason for this because, if you think about it with secrecy, who do you trust? Intelligence is very much a trust business, and you're going to let people into secrets. So you sort of look to your social network and social circles, and particularly a lot of the people who were part of these Ivy League institutions also are part of secret societies in them as well. And so, you're building a network even before intelligence, and this is an era of amateurs. And so as intelligence professionalizes, it does extend outside of the Ivy Leagues, but there was the impression that it was, this is the popular saying, pale, male, and Yale. That was the CIA. But there were reasons for that, because how else were you going to recruit people you trusted? Now, that is a double-edged sword, though, because it can be accused, the intelligence community can be accused of being elitist. And certainly we saw a cultural shift in education in the United States in the 1960s, 1970s. There were revelations that, the academic community was working with the intelligence community at the time. A very famous article in 1967, this Ramparts article reveals that the CIA was working with the National Students Association. And that was something we always accused the Soviets of doing is, they're manipulating students. They're using academics for national security for sinister purposes. We were doing the same thing. And so you saw a schism develop between academia and intelligence, whereas before they were pretty closely intertwined. So, fast forwarding to where we are today, I see a burgeoning relationship again. We certainly need the intelligence community recruits people who go to these institutions. We should produce students who are conversant in intelligence affairs. It's not that we're training them to be intelligence officers, but at least understand the issues in the intelligence community, understand the analyst policymaker relationship, understand where intelligence fits under US national security and statecraft. And so I think that there's a renewed and very hopeful relationship that's burgeoning between the intelligence community and academia. However, one particular point in your question always is fascinating when you talk about intelligence. So academia, called the ivory tower, we're considered insular, sort of pencil-neck academics. The intelligence community is insular too, and particularly the CIA. And so they have their own culture and peculiarities as well. And, to your point of what they want, so just like I think, we joked around about this, but what does anyone want? They want all the benefits with none of the disadvantages or costs of a relationship. And so what would the IC want from academia? All the benefits of that relationship with none of the costs. So one thing that intelligence is in the business of, and particularly when we're talking about the clandestine service and recruiting spies, is manipulation. And that's something that I think becomes a sticking point in intelligence's relationship with anyone, academia, the private sector, NGOs, are they manipulating us? The answer is probably yes, just like in any contractual relationship, you're trying to obtain the best benefit for yourself. But, is it a sinister thing? I guess that depends on your perception of American national security and, whether we're doing good things or bad things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's yeah. To kind of like dig into like something you mentioned there about this like culture of trust on it, particularly, you can kind of see like, you end up instinctively trusting people who are more like you, that you have history with, all these other things. But the intelligence community now is a pretty big bureaucracy as far as I can tell. And trust kind of has to work differently in a bureaucracy there. And something you've actually written about, which like ever since, I know we talked about this a little bit, ever since that I read it, I can't kind of stop thinking about it, is like, how does an intelligence community try to figure out trust? Do we trust this person? Historically, it seems that it's been about two factors. It's been like, is this person, like you said, going to be manipulated, or are they manipulable? in some respects around like, do they have close personal relationships with people in adversarial countries, particularly those who are known to be very aggressive and trying to steal secrets from the US, like China, for example. And then, or are they heavily indebted in some way? Are they likely prospects for selling secrets for money? And I think it's something you wrote about this young man here in Massachusetts, I believe. He like basically leaks secrets on Discord, which like it. I guess I never really quite understood. Was it because he was disenfranchised really from it, or was he just trying to show off on it? Was he like an 18-year-old who just says like the judgment of an 18-year-old sort of thing? And like, how do you start to build like figure out that when you're not like when those two classic factors of money or whether that like they have personal ties to people in an adversarial regime? What do you think is the right way to start to like understand trust? Sorry, there was a long question, but it's like a really super big one that's like has implications beyond just like the intelligence community.
Absolutely. And, you know, ever since, so I mentioned Nathan Hale, when you think about Benedict Arnold, who's the arch villain, you know, the arch traitor of the Revolutionary War, he was a hero during most of the Revolutionary War. And then he was court-martialed. He wasn't promoted. He became disaffected, you know, with the cause, and he ends up spying. So you have to be careful of how you treat your people. And we've learned a few times besides Benedict Arnold in American history, you know, especially be careful how you treat your spies or your intelligence officers, the people that are privy to your secrets, because they can do a lot of damage. You know, you had mentioned the historical approach, sort of the Cold War era approach. Look at a person's ideology. So do you want a member of the Communist Party of the United States holding a security clearance during the Cold War? Probably not. It happened, incidentally, during the Second World War, and that's one of the reasons the Soviets were so successful is because different organizations, including the very famous Office of Strategic Services, didn't really adhere as much to the ideological boundary, and so they had communist sympathizers. And some of them ended up being communist spies. You know, sort of live by the sword, die by the sword of your risk tolerance for having people who think like your enemy or share the same beliefs. Then what we also saw, as you pointed out, was ways that you can compromise people. So indebtedness, gambling, sexual proclivities. So homosexuals were targeted by the government for people who weren't trustworthy. And so basically, can a foreign country get dirt on you that then they can use to compel you? And then you also mentioned just, you know, a more pedestrian one, which is money, like selling out for it. There's another one that I think gets us closer to this answer, and you had mentioned it with, I think his name was Teixeira. This is the Air Force analyst, you know, young kid who plays video games, and I think it was a combination of factors. You said he wants to show off, he wants to show that something important's happening and people aren't paying attention, and then he had his own beliefs about the Russo-Ukrainian war, and so you know that I think helps put together why he released information. And ego is, you know, someone's ego can be, well, you know, your government isn't treating you well. You're a really smart person and you deserve better. And it's a foreign intelligence officer doing that. And you make yourself important in a very bad way by dumping classified information. But this gets us to something that I think is more pertinent today and that our counterintelligence system is having a hard time coping with. So it wasn't just Teixeira, but reality winner, NSA employee, Edward Snowden, famously, Chelsea Manning. What do you do about people, sort of like Benedict Arnold's, who actually start out in your service? You give them clearances because they don't, you know, they don't show any sort of vulnerabilities at the time, and then they become disillusioned over the course of their career. And anyone who has worked for government, which I have, and I think I'm on solid ground saying this, any job, you're going to get disaffected with at different points in time. You know, the question is, though, if you're disaffected with your whatever job you work, do you go into the office the next day and burn the building down? And that's sort of, you know, figuratively speaking, that's kind of what releasing classified information would be, is you kind of burn the building down. The issue, though, here is, you know, this is a younger generational thing that I'm seeing as well. I see it in academia, is it's okay to question the United States and American national security policy. But what I always try and emphasize is that's okay. And let's compare it now. What is the alternative? During the Cold War, I think a lot of people understood we weren't perfect, but the alternative was far worse. Now we live in this sort of blurry world, or at least I see a lot of confusion, in college age, younger generation who are going into the intelligence community, going into the military. And if they don't know who the right side is, in spite of our flaws, it's not even a matter of a foreign intelligence organization getting a hold of them. That would be bad because they're trained in manipulation and they can really tug these strings a lot harder. But it's already a problem if you become disaffected with your own cause during your career. And so, how do you find this in a counterintelligence investigation? Well, it almost has to be continuous. But what we've done is we have this new, and you've seen this probably in the private sector as well, that idea of the insider threat. And I actually don't think that's a very good solution because it creates a very toxic and it creates a bad work dynamic if you're saying, I need to keep my eye on the person next to me. And so I think this has applications both public and private sector, which is how do you maintain morale of your employees that they're doing the right thing, serving the right cause?
Yeah, and it does actually extend to these companies. I was out in San Francisco a couple months ago as a routinely go out there, and I was going in for a meeting at OpenAI. And the disclosures and everything I had to sign to go into the building are pretty significant. But that's a standard thing now. To go in and to think that companies are like guarding that information. And like you said, it is now something that like releasing information about a new model coming out, that's a fireable offense on it. Obviously, you're probably not going to wind up in prison for doing that. But that culture of it has moved into some of these companies who are fairly kind of high stakes there. I guess I guess a question I had here is like how like sometimes they presume that there's like what is a secret is really well defined. Like it's secret information, it's information that's not out there in the public. But how is it handled when a lot of the information is not secret anymore? And that's where it's like you didn't like because there's a lot of open source used now, and here at Filter Labs, we analyze open source data all the time on it, and that and it's become clear at times that intelligence communities across our allies come to us, ask us questions about things that they might not have the manpower. Some of the smaller countries might not have the technology to be able to find what we're finding, and realizing that oh, there's some level of confidentiality, there's some level of secrecy here, but it's not about these these things out in the world. We know them as well. And so I guess, is that just simply oh, it's just our conversation internally, or how it kind of wraps into our operations? Or is there more of an effort to try to define what a secret is anymore?
And I think that's a huge issue now with the massive information that we have and the rapid availability of it. Twitter, for instance, when someone in Pakistan can tell you they hear helicopters over their house in Abbottabad, how much longer do you have plausible deniability? The idea in covert action is that you can deny that you were the person who did something. And so the space for performing intelligence operations is, if not shrinking, then at least becoming much, much more difficult. And so one of the debates within intelligence is, are we overclassified? I would say certainly. When especially as an intelligence historian, I took a picture when I was in the archives a few years ago of a document, and it was just the most banal, boring, plain document from an MID report in 1903 that was only declassified in 1973. Because you don't have the workforce working to declassify things, because bureaucracies do want to protect. Max Weber, the very famous German scholar of bureaucracy and the administrative state, said that secrecy is a source of bureaucratic power. And so for secret intelligence organizations, secrecy is a source of power. Controlling that information, even from each other, which is why coordination in the intelligence community is a problem, is a source of power. And so, we have too many secrets, and a lot of times they're used to protect people, to protect the bureaucracy itself, because people are to the point on insider threat and being a leaker, people are afraid if they don't classify something, they're going to get in trouble. And so there's, fear built into the bureaucracy and the personnel processes about, be careful with your paper, burn everything, burn notice type stuff. Um, so this is the balance between secrecy and transparency is an enormous problem in the intelligence community today because you need to rely on, as you said, more than just the intelligence community for some of the major challenges that this country's facing. And if you keep secrets, you don't get to tap into the incredible intellectual and innovative mass that is the American body politic. One of the most industrial, resilient, resourceful, innovative people, in history. If you're keeping secrets from them, you don't get to tap into it. And it's even worse if you're no longer the most innovative element. If the intelligence community isn't producing the best information or the best analysis, and private companies are, then you're sitting on secrets that are actually hamstringing you. So that's, the argument against secrecy. I do need to make an argument, though, on the other hand, about, for instance, open source intelligence, OSINT, which is a very hot topic right now, as you're well aware, with Filter AI. And the issue is there has to be a distinction between intelligence and information. And so to me, open source intelligence is not new. It's something that's always been done. People were picking up newspapers during the Civil War. That's why William Tecumseh Sherman hated journalists and called them spies, because newspapers, sources of information. The thing about OSINT today, though, is OSINT does something that can threaten the intelligence profession. And I'm not saying intelligence community, I'm saying intelligence profession, because it took a very long time in this country to professionalize intelligence. And that is that it sort of indicates to people, policymakers, CEOs who rely on open source intelligence, that anyone can do intelligence because it's open source. Like anyone can do it. My analysis is just as good as yours. And I actually had this conversation with students when I was at a former institution teaching military professionals. I said, how many of you, these are military intelligence professionals, how many of you have had the problem where the person you're briefing, so imagine if you're a CEO or a general, you're on your phone before you walk into the skiff or the meeting or the closed environment, and you're looking at information relevant to your decision making. Now that information could possibly be in competition with your analysts and your briefers and the people who are supposed to be pulling a lot of information together and making good judgment calls. So you're weighing your information against theirs in a way where, they say in the military, it's like doing land navigation. You have to trust your compass. You have to trust your equipment. You're no longer as trusting of your equipment, of your compass, of, the people whose job is to analyze intelligence, not just information. And so what open source intelligence has the danger of doing to the intelligence community is deprofessionalizing it, or at least to the public perception, making it seem like, why do we need secret intelligence agencies anymore? Anyone can pull information off the internet and do intelligence. And so to me, that's a big distinction between open source intelligence being one basically publicly available information that's then pulled in and combined with secret intelligence or analysis that's done for secret purposes, because that's the other thing people don't really pay attention to is it's not just a matter of secret information. That's intelligence. We collect secret information. No, it can be open information, but you're analyzing it secretly because you don't want another country to know what it is about them that you're interested in. So there's always a secret component to this information. And I would say that's what separates intelligence from information.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to respond to that in a lot of ways. And I guess the one thing that I was kind of struck by, particularly in conversations, particularly as we kind of get into negotiations with them about how to onboard them onto our platform and things like that, is realizing their questions that they have are something that they guard most closely on it, and such that the analyst question, because that tells you potentially a lot about a vulnerability, about what they don't know on it, is what's mostly guarded on it. And I guess that's kind of one of those things, and then we kind of get into these things like, we can help you, but it's hard to help you if we don't know your questions. on it, but they don't share the questions, and it's these points at which like do they like how to navigate that seems to be where we get in all our conversations with people who sit in classified domains. And I guess to some extent, like that's not a new problem. I'm kind of wondering whether this is something that is more common now.
Yeah, I would definitely say yes because of if there's always been public-private sector cooperation in intelligence. Um, the public sector intelligence community, and particularly in certain disciplines, for instance, signals intelligence, they need the private sector. They need access to data and systems. It's dangerous. It's one of the really fraught areas of American civil intelligence relations because generally Americans are more disposed to give information to private companies, personal information. I trust that when I go on my cell phone, that my conversation isn't going to go straight from Verizon to NSA, even if that's what happens. Um, but you trust that it won't because you think that it's there's a barrier between public-private sector. That hasn't always been the case. In fact, it's less and less the case today. It's a balancing act that I really worry. How are we striking that balance? Because again, fundamentally, we'd like to believe as Americans that there should be a barrier between what the government is allowed to access about us because privacy is elemental to liberty. And so with public-private sector cooperation almost being taken for granted today in the intelligence community and outside of it, well, of course they cooperate. They have to cooperate. We're not asking ourselves harder questions about where to draw the line. So asking you that question back is, obviously it makes sense that you're trying to help a government client, for instance, and they're not giving you everything. Do you worry about how, I mentioned this earlier with academia, and you're an academic as well, how they're using that information? And how do you, as both an academic and person in charge of a business, how do you keep yourself out of trouble and control how the government might manipulate or use the help that you offer?
I mean, that's a really good question. One that, I think every company deals with internally there. Um, and part of it is that not every employee is going to be equally comfortable with the customer set that you have. And there could be various reasons why. It's not like it's not because like tech is filled with anti-American, very progressive types. I don't think that's actually anywhere near the case at all. I think there's probably more American dynamism in tech than anti-Americanism. I think if anyone, like if there's one community who is like more like optimistic about America, it's probably tech there. So but they're kind of like they're holding together a lot of other equities on it, and so we do care about it. And we get approached by a lot of foreign intelligence agencies there, and what we do kind of talk through, like, well, are we really comfortable with that country there? I think that as an American company, we're very like kind of clear about this with our employees, that we are like we do support this mission in a lot of respects, and that's not idiosyncratic, that's not controversial. They kind of understand that, but there are some other countries that might kind of approach us and want to look at things, and there's some hesitations around it, and we have to think through that internally on it. And some of it has to do with whether we think they're going to be responsible users of the information on that. And a lot of it, like between like there's this really thin line between like competence, like judging someone as incompetent and judging someone as corrupt. And sometimes it's really, really hard. It's harder than you think to figure out whether someone is going to be corrupt with it. But if you don't think someone's going to handle your data, no one's going to be able to interpret your insights, your results competently, you do know that the likelihood of it coming to corrupt ends is higher on it. And so those are some things that we kind of look at as like, are they good? It's kind of a question after like each call. It's like, do you think they're good? Are they asking the right questions? That we could tell they're not going to tell us their questions so much. And I don't know if the intelligence community understands that, like, we kind of like sit back after calls and kind of go like, are they smart? Like, what do you think?
That's actually very refreshing to hear. One of the things that I'm a huge proponent. One of the reasons I wrote the book, um, and my driving sort of, I guess, personal mission as an academic is to sort of bridge, civil intelligence relations, or bridge gaps between the intelligence community and then American civil society, the American people. And there's a lot of myths and misperceptions about intelligence. And, when you read about the best and worst of it, best case, worst case, successes and failures, one thing that I am very careful of doing, and this is something that I've had to explain carefully to friends who are from the intelligence community, is intelligence is un-American. That's the bottom line. That's why we're so uncomfortable with it. The conversation you have with your employees, what you're doing is just, there's a certain like hesitation about how is this being used, and we can't know because it's secret, and do we trust these people with what we're going to do for them, and that applies to foreign intelligence as well. But that doesn't mean that the people who do intelligence are un-American. Or to your point about tech, my brother's an MIT grad, and I've always been very impressed, like when I've talked to his friends, about, like you said, the sort of dynamism and the thoughtfulness and independence of thinking too, of tech-oriented people. And so it's always heartening when I hear intelligence professionals, no less than private sector intelligence people like yourself, who are asking themselves these questions. I was able to talk to a class of intelligence professionals a while ago, and we were talking about domestic intelligence. And that's a extremely touchy area because we're talking about spying on Americans. Now, I just want to be clear, like, we're not talking about the U.S. intelligence community is actively doing unconstitutional things. That wasn't the conversation. But the conversation was, I was bringing about historical case studies when the IC did unconstitutional domestic surveillance and spied on politicians, for instance. And the students were genuinely concerned about this. We had genuine good conversation. So, aside from the fact that just because intelligence is un-American, if you work for the American intelligence community, it doesn't make you un-American. You can be a patriot, but you're just in a job, a profession that it just flies in the face of everything we're taught to believe as Americans. So there's that, but then there's also, okay, and you're also an individual with these beliefs, but if you work for a company, if you work for a government, if you work for a bureaucracy, how we all know when you're part of one of those machines, the individualism, the individual ideas, the sense of right and wrong, you go from morality to sort of like organizational ethics and culture, that can get blurred or lost even. And so how do you maintain that in a bureaucracy that's driven by, for instance, profit in the case of the private sector, or this like national security mission where you can become very Machiavellian? And it's easy to fall into the whole, sort of teleological ends justify the means mentality, and you sort of lose that sense of, the initial conversation that you have where you're like, we don't really think we should be doing this, but the mission calls for it, or the board members call for it, or yeah. So I don't know how you tackle that, and especially where you are, because you're literally at the nexus of both of these problem sets.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that's something that I've kind of like increasingly like come around to, is that like how much you don't really get around the requirement to make judgments, moral judgments, just because you're in public sector there, and such that like, okay, we have all sorts of moral judgments in the private sector, and equally you aren't actually free of making life and death decisions in the private sector from those that occur in the public sector at times, particularly that in the military intelligence sorts side of the public sector as well, that these aren't really clean things. And I think one thing, so I keep thinking, and like as you're talking about this, so about students I've taught, particularly at the University of Virginia. I was there, a faculty member there, and I taught a course that was quite popular. It was called God, Money, and Terror. And so it was a great course. Yeah, it was probably the best title of a course I've ever come up with. And that, if anyone who teaches university, they know the title of your course matters more than anything else on it. What what I kind of like what I'm thinking about there is like the students who went in to the like intelligence community. And so like people who obviously took this class had a certain interest in things, and often they had already done their internship with, the big, the CIA. And so they were kind of like basically on their way in, or they were kind of like thinking about going in that direction. And a lot of it I think came back to a lot of the questions is how do they form moral judgment over these things within this culture on it? What do they do, and how do they um, kind of exercise that responsibly in a way that like lives up to their own sense of like value and worth there, while also respecting it? And that's something that young employees at Filter Labs deal with, as well as my students who went in that direction. And you might have, you might go and have a drink with them or a dinner, and they're not going to tell me anything specific about it, but you can tell they're wrestling with that. And I do wonder whether like um, the like we've we don't spend, I guess, as a society or as a government or as a country enough time helping intelligence officers understand how they might relate to civilian life, how they might relate to the project of our democracy in a way that I think you've written about this, about how like there's been more training about military and civilian relations, but there's really nothing that exists, or correct me if I'm wrong, between like an intelligence officer to like understand like their relationship other than in, like platitudes about it.
No, you're right. One of the foundations for my work was civil military relations, American civil military relations, the history of it, the theory of it. The foundational figure Samuel Huntington, who was I had a sort of personal connection to him because Huntington was the PhD advisor, mentor, and then dear friend of a professor of mine who, was my professor in undergrad, and I've known him for 20 plus years. And so I had a very personal connection to civil military relations and Huntington. And so as I got into intelligence studies, and this is even before my PhD, I asked myself, well, why don't we talk about civil intelligence relations? And one of the counters that I would receive often enough from intelligence officers was, well, isn't that like civ mil relations? And my response is only to the extent that you think your job is exactly like a military officer's. And then it's like, oh, wait, it's different. The intelligence profession is different than the military profession. There's different traits, there's different organizational cultures, personalities, factors that you indoctrinate for and prioritize in recruitment, training, promotion. And so that became sort of, again, the personal academic mission that I had, is to introduce the idea of American civil intelligence relations. And as for you, and we'd already discussed, intelligence is insular, it's secretive. You have people who leave for very long periods of time, and then they can come back and be strangers in their own country. I would say, and this is anecdotal, but most of my friends, in or from the intelligence community are they aspire to be, if not, they're very close to, they're American citizens. They feel that way. But I think that subconsciously things happen in a career because it's just too formative to spend 20 years doing something in a certain environment where certain traits are emphasized. And you can lose that connection. And so, my book is called The Spy in the State, like, a riff off Huntington's The Soldier in the State. But, as I say, it's more than the history of the spy in the state. It's the history of the spy, the state, and the American people, and maintaining the connection between all of them. And that especially today, when we see strains with secrecy and privacy, strains in politics between the intelligence community and elected officials, we're seeing civil intelligence relations is now something that is pulling the country apart rather than pulling it together. And so the more that spies understand their fellow citizens, I should really say intelligence officers understand their fellow citizens, that their fellow citizens understand intelligence, the more robust we can make our democracy, especially, that's just talking about the political side. But when we talk about information technology, surveillance powers, great power competition between rivals who are using intelligence for disinformation, to spy on us, to look for vulnerabilities in our society. Americans need to be conversant in intelligence, and American intelligence officers need to remember the first principle is, of what you're doing is don't destroy that which you're trying to defend. And I think again, what anchors this is the idea of civil intelligence relations.
Yeah. That strikes me as, like, absolutely right, and it's, like, so many people and, like I said, like, I'm not from that community. I sit at and I look at it from the outside, the intelligence community, as that but I probably know more about it than the average American at this point on it, and it's, like, hear people, even, like, relatives sometimes talk about the intelligence community as sometimes, like, all powerful, all knowing. Like, you take if the attributes classically, ascribed to God, get ascribed to the intelligence community, is like, I don't think that's true, kind of thing. And like even on the question is like, oh, of course, like the US has all this data. I've kind of like subsequently learned, like, oh, no, they don't. They actually are trying to look for it themselves, or they have rules around not being able to get it that a lot of Americans don't actually appreciate all the time. And it was like just like the 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 public awareness of it, the public like narratives that like I think the CIA particularly seems to have benefited from like spy movies to help drive recruitment on it, and that doesn't seem like most of the intelligence officers' lives. That I've had some interaction with is on that. So, but I think that has formed a lot of Americans' views on it. And I mean, I guess how would we go about educating America without violating, the confidentiality, the secrecy of the intelligence community?
Sure, and it's a two-way street. The funny thing is the intelligence community wants the American people to trust them. This is something that's a repeating theme when you read, like NIEs. We're publishing this so the American people can see what we're thinking. You hear intelligence officials say that, like, we need to make sure the American people trust us. But if you want the American people to trust you, you have to trust them too. Trust is a two-way street. And so that includes with transparency. And that's something the intelligence community is working on today, is trying to be more transparent within the realm of defending or protecting rather sources and methods. So people can make better judgment calls. Because the funny thing about is, if the intelligence community was so omnipotent or omniscient, then why does it fail so much? Because that's the other thing is you read often about its failures, and maybe it's because it's like misplaced expectations. You think it should be all knowing and all powerful. So why did it possibly fail? And so, again, that's an imbalance between the two. I think public-private sector cooperation is an area to build bridges. Journalism is of enormous importance. We're, just on the 50th anniversary of the Year of Intelligence, and just 2 weeks ago, Seymour Hersh's article that came out, Cy Hersh wrote a piece in December 1974 saying the CIA is spying on Americans, and that just blew years of mistrust out of the water. So, how journalists present the intelligence community, and how intelligence officials and public officials present intelligence, how private sector actors who are increasingly working with the intelligence community communicate that in, like you said, your meetings with each other, when you're talking about this. And then academics have a job to do, which is, I'm glad to see academic intelligence studies proliferating across institutions in the United States, because we are doing, I think, especially as intelligence historians, a lot to show the hidden role of intelligence in global affairs, not just always in a bad way, but in a good way. Sometimes you just didn't know that intelligence was involved, and it wasn't always a bad thing. And so, really, like, how do you do it? Well, it's the whole of nation, public-private sector cooperation, whole of government, whole of nation. And, really what it comes down to, again, is transparency. The American people are curious people, and they're very curious about spies. So, but you have to be careful, because where do they get their impressions of intelligence from? And so that's what we're doing with this conversation now, and that's why it's important to continue having this.
Yeah. Well, we're at the end of our time now, and I just want to like end with this question. And it's not a fair question just to like pop on you in this way. But if you were to like devise or recommend 3 reforms or 3 things that you would do to improve in civil intelligence relations, whether that's just on like awareness over it, to get to a better place, what would those 3 things that you would like walk into? There's a new administration coming in, as we all know, and it actually might be a weird opening um, to talk about a way to like reset this relationship. And because they are coming with some people who have been fairly critical, and they're putting some people in places that ahead of agencies that they've criticized. And like, what would be the 3 things that you would want to communicate to them to say, do these 3 things, and you're going to get both what like the intelligence community you think the American people deserve here, also a better long-term relationship between intelligence and the people it's meant to protect.
Absolutely. And I like your framing of it. I've sort of been writing and tackling this one recently is everyone expects the next administration to be disruptive for intelligence. That doesn't mean that disruption has to be a bad thing, though. It can be disruptive in a good way if the reforms are directed at the right things. This is going to be a perfectly self-serving argument as an intelligence historian, but you'd be surprised how many intelligence officers don't know their own history. I mean, they even have like the mythologized version of their own history, like CIA with Donovan and OSS and the Jedburghs, and missing like really key pieces of how and why CIA was formed. So, within professional intelligence education, as opposed to professional military education, but it would be helpful there as well. Making an American intelligence history a core part of the curriculum. It's always surprising to me when it's not like a mandatory part of the curriculum. Like you don't even know where you came from, and yet you're trying to tackle the problems of today. So, again, very self-serving argument, but I do think it's important. The other one would be, and these are more pointed perhaps, but this is where I'm leaning on my expertise in the field. Congressional oversight needs to be reformed. The congressional intelligence oversight committees are supposed to be, Congress has been bitterly politicized, and intelligence is a great way to leak and counterleak and use information and clobber your political opponent on both sides of the aisle. That we need more comprehensive and bipartisan intelligence oversight that is also focused on transparency, on the efficiency of the intelligence community, on protecting American civil liberties, and that those are the people we elect. So we need to re-look at the congressional intelligence oversight model. And last but not least, I like, I'm an intelligence historian, so I always like to look for the things in the shadows or the overlooked things. But as part of the post 9/11 intelligence reforms, the 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, which is coming up on 20 years as well, we tried to create a privacy and civil liberties oversight board, and it's small, underpowered, doesn't have full-time staff. If you really want to rile people, and this goes to our conversation about secrecy too, Jonathan, put a wider cross-section of Americans on that board, make it a full-time job, give them declassification authority across the intelligence community. That will shake some people up, because now you're saying, you're selecting and vetting these citizens, but you're taking that telephone book approach to transparency and asking the average American, okay, this is what the IC is doing. Should they be doing it or not? And then they have a right to declassify it. So you can't hide behind the classification. That is a major proposal. It's one I would never expect to go through, but how else are we going to get there? And sometimes I have seen moments in American intelligence history where catastrophe happens and major reform happens. Why do we have to wait for the next major catastrophe before we implement reform? And we don't need to.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, I think a really important question that I hope we have better answers to in the future. It's really been a pleasure to have this. Been a fun conversation. I hope people will listen to the whole conversation to this. But yeah, so how can people like learn about your work, follow you on that? The Spy in the State. Highly recommend the book. Tell our listeners how they can learn more about you and Keep up with your excellent work.
Sure. So I go in and out of like I don't post a ton on Twitter, but I usually repost. I like to repost things that are happening in intelligence studies so people can see what we're doing. So this is a fairly easy one, but my Twitter handle is at the spy the state. I couldn't put an ampersand in there because I guess Elon Musk didn't, or when he didn't own it when I got on it. But it's just at the spy the state. I do have somewhat of a public profile on GNSI, the Global and National Security Institute website. And I'm also the vice president of the Society for Intelligence History, which is international society of intelligence historians growing. And so we periodically put on conferences or events. And, of course, the big one is the book is coming out in May, The Spy in the State, The History of American Intelligence, with Oxford University Press. And so, I'm supposed to say, go buy the book. That's something that I'm sort of learning how to say. But, fundamentally, it's to help the average American understand how the intelligence community got to where it is now and equip them with knowledge where they can become informed citizens and shape intelligence in the future.
Well, thank you for that, and very much looking forward to having you back on and talking about the spy in the state.
I'd be delighted.
So anyway, well, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jonathan.